So it's time for another of our Bankai theory crafting videos, and for this one, I think we're tackling easily one of the characters and zanpakuto that it is absolutely the hardest to design a Bankai for, but also one that I think a lot of people want to discuss and even more wanted to actually see, to the point where I think this might be the most desired Bankai reveal in all of Bleach, being of course none other than Sosuke Aizen and his zanpakuto Kyoka Suigetsu. Yes, despite being Bleach's main villain for over half of the story, and of course being involved in numerous fights himself, Aizen's Bankai, arguably one of the most anticipated of the series, was never revealed. Now, there are a lot of questions surrounding Aizen's potential Bankai, questions that couldn't really be asked about anyone else, such as, does he even have a Bankai, and why is it seemingly so hard to come up with one for this character compared to most others? In this video, I'll try to answer as many of these questions as I can, while also presenting 3 Bankai ideas of my own. As always with these videos, I'd love to know which of my theories you think is the best, which is your favourite, but more importantly, what your ideas are for Aizen's hypothetical Bankai 2 down in the comments. And before we get started with the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support from me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And as always, I want to give a massive shout out and say a huge thank you to everyone supporting me over there on Patreon. I really do appreciate it so very much. Okay, so let's begin, as we always do with these videos, by looking at the surrounding context, namely Kyoka Suigetsu as a zanpakuto and its Shikai ability, as this flows nicely into the question of why it is so hard to think of a Bankai for Aizen at all. Kyoka Suigetsu with the release command Shatter through the power of complete hypnosis, or Kanzen Saimin, has the ability to create nigh perfect illusions that confuse all 5 of the senses, making the illusions nearly impossible to detect. Not only that, but in order for you to fall under the zanpakuto's spell, you need only see Aizen release his Shikai once. Then you're captive for life. It's not a case where the effect wears off after some time. If you've seen Aizen's Shikai be activated even once in your life, you'll never truly know if what you're seeing, smelling, tasting, touching, or hearing is real ever again when Aizen is involved, which is truly pretty terrifying. And this right here is why it's so hard for people to think of a Bankai for Aizen. His Shikai already is completely all-encompassing, to the point where it virtually doesn't have a weakness. It is effectively flawless already. In fact, its weakness, if you can really call it that, is so odd as to feel contrived, or at least in my opinion anyway. You must be touching the blade itself before Aizen activates it, or you must be blind. A Bankai is obviously supposed to be essentially a considerably more powerful version, a second stage of a Shikai, but how do you get more powerful than complete hypnosis? How do you improve on that which is already airtight? The closest we really came to potential issues for Aizen, again, if you can even really call them that, were Unohana detecting something was ever so slightly off with his fake corpse, and Yamamoto being able to tell that Aizen was real by the Reiatsu lodged in his gut when Aizen stabbed him. But that's literally it, and honestly, they are hardly weaknesses, and they already only extend to his Shikai. If he has a Bankai, we have no idea what, if any, weaknesses that would have either. In Shikai, Aizen's illusions seem to be virtually limitless in scope, although we never really see him doing too much more than creating essentially fake people, such as when he tricks Harabel into attacking a version of himself, which then splits apart like a cracked mirror, or fooling the Gote 13 into thinking they're fighting him when he isn't really there at all. He himself mentions that it can make a fly appear to be a dragon or a swamp look like a water garden with all the sensory trimmings attached. One of the larger scale illusions we actually get to see is Aizen tricking Baragon into thinking that his court is still intact, when in reality, Gin and Tosen have butchered all of his men in secret until that truth is revealed. Even if Aizen's enemies know about his hypnotic powers, they have no idea or indication they're under the influence of his ability story, such as when Shinji realised too late that they'd been fooled ever since Aizen's first clash with Hitsugaya during the fake Karakura Town battle. And so that's why it's so tough to do, why it feels like such a Herculean task. How do you possibly improve, or even interpret this power in a different, creative, and ultimately useful way? Which of course leads us nicely to our next question. Does Aizen even have a Bankai? Aizen is really the only character we can ask this of. Outside of Kenpachi Zaraki, supposedly all the other captains, certainly when the series begins anyway, have a Bankai. After all, it's a prerequisite to becoming a captain. But based on what we know Aizen's Kyoka Suigetsu can achieve, it's highly feasible he doesn't have a Bankai at all, but instead simply showed other captains an illusion of a Bankai during his aptitude test for promotion. We know that when Aizen gathered everyone to him to demonstrate his zanpakuto at some point in the past, he was lying about its ability and showed them something false. According to Isane, Aizen claimed Kyoka Suigetsu was a water-type zanpakuto that used reflections of fog and water to confuse his enemies. What's interesting about this lie is even if Aizen has a true Bankai of his own based on complete hypnosis, presumably he made up a Bankai in this vein as well in order to receive his promotion. And yet, despite all of this, I do in fact think Aizen has an actual Bankai to call his own for a few different reasons. Despite being incredibly arrogant and sure of his own power, though often not without the power to back it up, Aizen never really inflates his own strength to be beyond what it is, except for when he becomes delusional during deicide. I think this stems from the fact that Aizen has always known he is considerably more powerful than virtually all of his peers, all of his contemporaries, and so because of that, he has no real need to artificially inflate his successes, his achievements. He can do basically everything he says he can do, he can back it up, so there's no real need to lie about his actual power. Like I said, it's only in deicide when he begins to become confused, when he begins to become delusional and detached, that he starts thinking and spouting that he is more powerful than he actually is, because he can't accept the actual reality of what's going on. Knowing what we do about him, about his desire to go beyond the strength of a normal Shinigami, I don't think he'd be satisfied in doing so without first having a Bankai. How can you possibly say you've reached the peak of being a Shinigami without one? How can you truly go beyond without having first attained the final stage of a zanpakuto, often considered to be the peak of what a regular Shinigami should be able to achieve? Although I say regular in quotation marks because at the end of the day it's only a special, powerful and dedicated few that will even attain Bankai in the first place. To me, achieving Bankai, and I think he probably did so at quite a young age, probably just felt like another step Aizen would take on his path to incredible power. Aizen was believed to have mastered all 4 of the traditional Shinigami combat arts, and if that's true, which it seems to be, that feels like only half the battle for a Shinigami who wants to truly have it all. Having a Bankai seems to go hand in hand with that mastery, to me at least, so that's why I think he had a Bankai, despite perhaps having every reason not to need one. So then, what could Aizen's Bankai actually be? I've got 3 potential ideas, 2 that really play into the theme of illusions, and 1 that I feel is a little more unorthodox, but we'll get into it. I have explanations for all as well, so let's dive in. And be warned, for this part there will be spoilers for the 1000 Year Blood War Arc 2, so take note. The first idea I have for Aizen's Bankai feels like the most conventional of the 3. Like I mentioned before, although it's seemingly feasible that Aizen's illusions can be as large in scope as he likes, we never really see that too often. His illusions are generally fixed upon changing one particular individual, whether it's creating a fake corpse for himself, or hiding who is actually battling Yhwach at the end of the Quincy Blood War. So the first idea I have for his Bankai is that it would create some kind of illusory world of massive scope. It would have the power to change an entire battlefield right down to the smallest detail, and of course all 5 senses would still be affected. I came up with this idea when I was thinking of a potential rewrite of the final battle. I was kind of challenging myself to come up with a means of having Aizen use Bankai in the fight against Yhwach and actually have it be useful in some way. And so I thought, with Yhwach on the ropes after Ichigo cuts him in half with Getsuga Tensho, he attempts a different strategy, and using the overwhelming power of the Soul King, blankets the entire battlefield in total darkness, plunging Ichigo and Aizen into essentially a pitch-black world, a little like we see him do to the Seirete when his body is expelling all of the surplus Reiatsu of the Soul King himself. So with the entire world, the entire Soul Society essentially now shrouded in this darkness, Ichigo would think there's no way to win. Now he's basically blind, both in sight and Reiatsu, as Yhwach's godlike power would just be crushing everything at this point, making it nearly basically impossible to narrow down where he actually is. This is where Aizen would come in, having Ichigo see his Zanpakuto release and then activating Bankai. I think that would be quite a watershed moment, as it would have Ichigo showing enough maturity to trust Aizen to this point, knowing that he needs him to help win this fight. While it wouldn't dispel Yhwach's darkness, it would create an illusory version of the battlefield complete with a false light source and everything, that would essentially expose Yhwach's position and allow Ichigo to finish him off for good. And so yeah, this idea of creating a full-scale illusory world complete with light sources, complete with all the other senses being affected, is pretty much the most conventional of the 3 ideas for Aizen's Bankai that I've got. The second idea, I think, is kind of cool in that in many ways it's a reflection of Shinji's Sakanade and how its Shikai and Bankai seem to function in the opposite way to most, and I like having a possible connection between Aizen and Shinji beyond just their powers both being able to play tricks on their enemies. So where Shinji's Shikai is useful against a single opponent but his Bankai is only really useful against multiple enemies at once, Aizen's would be the opposite of this. Where Kyoka Suigetsu is capable of affecting multiple enemies at once, as we see in his battle against the Gotei, his Bankai, this version of it, would be an extremely potent, concentrated illusion directed at one individual. Aizen's illusions tend to be exterior illusions. I don't know of a better way to phrase it than that, but what I mean is they're illusions that happen on the surface, in the real world, and everyone affected can see them. But what if Aizen's Bankai essentially trapped someone in their own mind? Aizen's Bankai could target an individual and make them see these extremely powerful and realistic illusions, but only in their head. No one else around them is afflicted. Now that's not to say Aizen couldn't target more than one person at once with this, but I think it's a more effective reflection of Sakanade when portrayed like this. The target in question would then be, for all intents and purposes, trapped forever in this illusory space in their mind until Aizen decides to set them free. It's pretty broken, but then so is Kyoka Suigetsu in general. And so actually, I really like this idea. I think it's quite sinister, and I think it's a neat evolution of Kyoka Suigetsu. And it also falls in line as well with many of the most powerful Bankai, both thematically and visually, being on a seemingly shrunken down and much smaller scale than their Shikai, where most Bankai tend to be blown out versions of their Shikai. Bankai like, for example, Tensa Zangetsu, Zanka no Tachi, Kenpachi's unnamed Bankai, at least visually all shrink down to be much smaller scale versions of that initial form, so I think that would play nicely with that idea as well. Now the third idea I have is definitely the most unorthodox, in that it doesn't really, at least to begin with, have anything to do with illusions at all. But I kind of like that, as I also think that fits Kyoka Suigetsu really well. The Zanpakuto has the power to make you see and experience things that aren't real. At its core, his Zanpakuto is a lie, it's a trick. So you might go into his Bankai expecting one thing, expecting illusions, only to be shown something completely different. Here, Aizen would have the power to shatter his opponent's abilities. In a sense, I suppose it would work in a similar way to at least a part of Yhwach's Almighty, where nothing that he has seen in the future can actually be used against him. Here, Aizen's Bankai would turn all abilities used against him and render them useless. For example, someone sends an energy blast towards Aizen, only for it to shatter. It wasn't real all along, and instead breaks apart into shards of glass. Taking this idea even further, and actually looping it back round to that core theme of illusions, in this version of his Bankai, Aizen would be the only thing that's actually real. All attacks sent his way would be made false and shatter into a million pieces as though mirrors themselves. And again, I do kind of like this one. I'm not sure I like it as much as the second one, but I think it's kind of a neat idea on principle. It's one of these kind of weird lateral Bankai that aren't quite associated with their Shikai, even though all Bankai technically are. But I don't know, I kind of like it. I think it's kind of neat, this idea that, again, it's a bit of an influx of what you'd expect from Kyoka Suigetsu, and that Aizen is the only one who's actually real here, whereas normally he himself is all about trickery and deception. So I think that would be kind of cool as well. But those are my 3 ideas for Aizen's Bankai. Honestly, it wasn't easy coming up with them for the reasons laid out earlier on in the video, but it was still fun. I think it's important to keep that core theme of illusions, as all Bankai are at least tenuously related to their Shikai counterparts, but here we have a few different ideas. Expanding the scope of the illusion, directing that illusion completely inward, or changing the perception of his Bankai itself, what you would expect to see from it. Kyoka Suigetsu is undeniably one of the toughest zanpakuto to think of a Bankai for, but hopefully you enjoyed this and think my ideas are at least somewhat decent. As always though, I'd love to hear your ideas for Aizen's Bankai down in the comments below. Let me know what you think, what potential ideas you have for a Bankai of Kyoka Suigetsu, and if you think there's any chance of us seeing his Bankai at all in the future. I've got to be honest, as much as I'd love to, I think chances are very slim, unless the anime pulls an amazing twist later on in the story. But that's it for the video, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, and until next time, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.